So on Friday, Parliament made history. It's been 30 years since the last budget was rejected. We saw it play out again. Not in my lifetime have I ever thought that it was possible to see an incumbent government have its budget rejected by Parliament. That's exactly what we saw on Friday. And it has thrown up a host of intricate, complicated matters and issues that we need to resolve. Because tomorrow, Parliament is back sitting, and the 2022 budget cannot remain rejected. I mean, everybody else agrees on that. This country requires this budget to be approved to avoid a crisis. We're already in the midst of a pandemic, which is having a serious impact on the economy already. So there's a consensus across board that the budget needs to be approved. The question is, what needs to be in the budget or be out of the budget for us to have this consensus? In other words, what has to give for this history to be, reversed, a budget that was rejected and then subsequently approved? That is the big question we're going to be considering. On the eve of Parliament returning, hopefully, to do something pretty different from what we saw and witnessed the historic scenes in Parliament last week. Now, whether or not the budget is approved tomorrow, many have said, revolves around this constitutional provision in the 1992 Constitution. And it says something very simple about the numbers you need. It's a numbers game, the numbers you need to get things passed in Parliament. And it says, in essence, except as otherwise provided in this Constitution, matters in Parliament shall be determined by the votes of the majority of members present and voting. So don't just take majority and say, oh, majority means the MPP side, by present and voting. And you know what happened? The majority MPP side were not in the chamber. They were not present and voting. So a lot of interpretations that has been thrown at this. We'll get to speak to the lawyers on this very short. We'll clear that up before anything else. But most importantly, it continues by saying with at least half of all the members of Parliament present. So for anything to happen, you need at least half of all members of Parliament present. And then out of that, majority of these members must be present and voting, right? So that is the fundamental basis of this controversy. So what happened in Parliament? We've had a majority side say what happened in Parliament was unconstitutional. When they say that it's a breach of this of this constitutional provision. Are they right? Let's look at the numbers, because the numbers is mathematics, right? And so everybody else can get into it. When the Constitution says with at least half of all members of Parliament present, we have a Parliament of 275 people, members of Parliament. At least half will be 137.5. You cannot have a 0.5 human being, right? So many have said, some have said, and this goes into the area of trying to interpret this, right? You have to go to what statistical norms and principles are and say, well, if it's 0.5, then a human being has to be what? 138. Which group has 138? The MPP side. Plus, if you add the independent candidate to it, there's a whole mix of things here. But if you look at this number, this is the number that voted to reject the budget on Friday. 137, because that's the number that the NDC side has in Parliament. The majority side left the chamber. They boycotted their own budget and left. And so they were left with 137. The question to ask is 137 at least half of all members of Parliament present? That's a key question to ask. Is 137 half? If your conclusion is that if you halving 275 divided by 2, you get this can be half. Don't listen to me. We'll talk to the lawyers very shortly. There's a whole complication here that the majority side say it is unconstitutional. So they'll be challenging this tomorrow. We'll see where they go with this when they come to the floor. On the back of that, the minority side, the NDC side, they've laid out their conditions. So tomorrow, they want the government to meet these 5 conditions before they will consider the question about whether or not to play ball and get the budget approved. What are these 5 key things that they put forward as a condition? Here, they want to withdraw the Japa deal because it was in the budget. They said, we don't even want to hear it. We don't want to touch it at all. Take it out. Suspend the 1.75 levy. We don't want to touch it. We don't want to hear it at all. We don't want to hear it at all. Take it out of the budget. They also say reconstruct the paragraph 829 of the the ACA deal, and then they also talk about the review the benchmark value for imports and make provision for Kita wave disaster. So those are the 5 issues, right, that they laid out as a condition for approving the budget. Now, we've had reaction from the majority side, and they have said that disregard reports concerning the rejection of the 2020 budget by Parliament. That's their point. Their point is exactly that it's unconstitutional, and that what they've done, it's illegal and must treat them with their contempt. But of course, the fact that you left the House doesn't mean that Parliament ceases to operate. That side, provided that they meet the threshold set by the Constitution, at least half can do the job. The question is, do we have half in the House at the time that the rejection happened? Now, the financial control power of the purse, we know it reserves. It's something that is a prerogative of Parliament to do. If you read the Constitution, it's very, very clear what Parliament's powers are as far as it is concerned. You cannot touch anything in terms of spending without going through Parliament. So that is clear. But something I need to bring to your attention is the budget cycle. If you break part of this cycle here, we don't have a budget. The budget will struggle. This country will struggle because it starts with a formulation, right? Which is what the finance ministry and the government did. Cabinet looks at it and approves it. And then it has to go to Parliament for approval, which is the next phase of the budget cycle. Once approved, it comes to, they trying to appropriate, right? And then you implement, and then you monitor, and then you go again. So it's a whole cycle that continues. What we have so far is a formulation. What we lack now, it is the approval, right? And without approval, nothing else is done. And this country is going to be in a standstill. If you go to the USA, they're very used to this. They have this crisis sometimes between the Democrats and Republicans where there's a shutdown of government because the legislature is not approving the budget. So that's possibly where we're going to get to now. But this is something very interesting in terms of, you look at the budget approval process. These are the timelines that the government itself set itself, and much of it is based on principle and convention, right? In terms of what they tend to do to you approve. But I want to pay attention to this here. This is approval of the budget statement and economic policy statement and appropriations bill. If you look at the calendar, this is the calendar, right, for the budget. Presentation of the budget was done. They were within time, right? Just tail end of November. What they need, what government needs to happen before the year ends is 1, budget approved, and 2, appropriations bill also passed. They have failed to get the approval. Without that, they can't move to the next step of appropriations bill, which is the main part of the deal. Without that, you can't spend. So they are running out of time. December is now almost approaching. They still have some time, by the way, because Parliament has until somewhere around 23rd to go on recess. So there's some time to do this. But the appropriations conversation also goes on for quite a while. So there's a whole mix of things that we need to consider. And what has to give is a major question. And that is why I put together a panel of economists, of civil society think tanks, and then lawyers to try and break this down. What has to get from a financial budget point of view, what can the government do without? From the legal point of view, how does the government get over this hurdle in Parliament, the majority side, in the argument? And then, of course, the policy side, how do you get both sides to a table to arrive at a compromise? These guests from all these angles here on PM Express. Stay with me after the break. My guest joining me tonight for this conversation is Inusa Fuseni. He's a former MP, Tamale Central, and a former Minister for Roads and Highways. He's a former ranking on the Constitutional Legal Affairs Committee in Parliament. Comes to this conversation with the depth of knowledge on how Parliament operates. He has his own thoughts on the constitutional provision in question. Also joining me with some thoughts on this from the legal side of things. It's a good friend of mine, Professor Kofi Abochi, Dean of the UPSC Law School, also joining me with his thoughts on this. Dr. Rashid Druman is the Executive Director of the Africa Center for Parliamentary Affairs and joins me also as we look at Parliament trying to resolve this, trying to build some consensus around this and what this will take. Later, I'll be joined by Professor Godfred Bokwe, Professor of Finance and Economics at the University of Ghana, as we try and, this is the budget after all. And so, I mean, in terms of the fiscal measures and the policy that was presented, what can government realistically accommodate? If you look at the demands that the minority had put out, which of them can this country accommodate not doing? Can we go without? We'll look at that very shortly. I want to start with Professor Abochi, because there's a legal question that is really at the heart of this debate that will play out tomorrow. That we really want to try and see if we can get some education on first. Professor Abochi, so I believe you followed this debate since Friday. I just laid it out at the beginning. Did you spot in the ensuing, discussions that led to the rejection, a possible breach of the constitutional provision surrounding how matters in Parliament are decided?
Good evening. First of all, I think it's important for us to recognize the novelty of this. We haven't experienced a thing like this before. And part of the reason we haven't is because of the traditional docility of Parliament. Parliament has been this body that traditionally has given the majority to government in power, and the very structure of the body from the Speaker down through to the divisions of the membership of Parliament. We haven't had a difficulty in terms of governance. There's been ease and fluidity of governance. For the first time, we seem to have had a certain division right down the middle. And then to make matters worse, as some will think, we have a Speaker who necessarily cannot easily be identifiable with a majority in the government. So we have a novelty on our hands, and that explains to a large extent probably the development we have playing out. Therefore, I did not anticipate, or, let's say ordinarily, I did not foresee
Okay, we appear to have lost his connection there. Hopefully we get him back, because he raised a very important point about the novelty of what has happened. In fact, the last time this happened, as I illustrated, it was under the Liman administration in the 1980s, when, of course, his budget was also rejected. He had to return with another budget, which was subsequently approved. Professor Abochi, do I have you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I lost you briefly, yes.
Okay, so in terms of whether or not this represents a constitutional breach, I think it's important for us to recognize the fact that the Constitution uses rather simple language. And the simple language is the decision in Parliament is taken by at least more than half of the membership of Parliament present and voting. So the key words there are present and voting. If we take the first word therefore requires presence. On the face of it, one would think this is easy. The complication of this, however, is what constitutes presence and what are the boundaries for determining presence, i.e., do we have a geographical space, or do we have, for want of a better word, do we have a physically delimited space within which, when a person is present, we can deem the person to be present for purposes of the constitutional definition of the word present. So, in some of the conversation, I basically just said, presence here should not be limited to the chamber of Parliament, but to the entire parliamentary space, i.e. the parliamentary building space. So, the Houses of Parliament, if you're in the presence of Parliament, if you are, say, on the car park of Parliament, if you're in Parliament and you're in your office, all these spaces are part of the physically delimited space of Parliament, and therefore all that part should be considered to be the space within which the word presence is contemplated. The problem is we do not have any definition of the word presence. The Supreme Court has not had the opportunity to consider this, and so as we speak, we can at best use one, parliamentary practices, and two, we can also then look to what is in accord with common sense. Again, the other word is voting. So present and voting. In other words, you must have been participating in the political processes that is considered voting. You must have been engaged in the acts, in the kinds of proceedings that can be defined to include voting. So you have to be present and you have to be voting. And that is where the difficulties of extending or expanding the definition of presence. Some of the arguments have tended to basically show that Parliament's own practices have contemplated MPs who are within their offices, within the larger parliamentary building. All these people have traditionally in the past been considered to be present in Parliament. And so some of them have run to the chamber to participate in voting during the period. And so while they're in their offices, they are still deemed to be in Parliament. They are still participating in parliamentary business. And therefore, this can be considered to be presence. Again, as I indicated, this hasn't been defined, judicially speaking. And so at this stage, all we can do is to engage in speculation. And I can assure you that it is not as straightforward as the definition of the word presence there may indicate. Of course, the biggest challenge for anyone seeking to extend it is when you have to consider the two together, i.e. not only present, but also present and voting. So it's not a case of just you being in your office, for example, for that to be determined as present. You have to be present, not only present, but you actually have to be present and voting. The conjoined word and, as opposed to the disjoint word or, is what is used. So you're actually present and voting. So you're not only present, but you're actually present and participating in a particular process. But as I indicated, every interpretation to that is proffered would have to be in accordance with common sense and in accordance with one that doesn't necessarily stultify the parliamentary business and parliamentary work. In this case, we have the majority actually walking out. So they had the opportunity of participating, but at a point in time, they chose to walk out. And indeed, they did walk out. When they walked out, the question is, where were they? Were they still within the general premises of Parliament? And if they were still within the general premises of Parliament, were they at any point in time, or is any member of the majority at any point in time participating in the proceedings of voting? So these are the complications, and I can assure you that whatever answer I proffer to you at this stage will be just my opinion, and the issues are not straightforward unless we have a clear case of judicial determination. And in conclusion, I just have to state to you that the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court over the years have tended to shy away from dabbling in the business of Parliament. In fact, the Supreme Court has decided in the case of Tufo and Attorney General that the business of Parliament is a closed book. In fact, it was described as a black box. Nobody knows what's in there and nobody wants to know what's in there. And Parliament has variously been described as a master of its own proceedings. And therefore, what Parliament does is Parliament's determination is said to be dispositive. What Parliament decides is conclusive. And the courts don't ordinarily, open what Parliament has decided and inquire into that. So that is going to be one of the limitations on any attempt by the court to want to go into this, except that the caveat has been stated that in respect of Parliament being a master of its own proceedings, when it comes to express breaches of constitutional provisions, those ones the court can intervene and make a determination. So that's the only caveat in this instance, because we seem to have a clear case of Article 104 being a clear case of a constitutional provision, as opposed to, say, the standing orders of Parliament, in respect of which normally the court would say we don't want to have anything to do with that.
Okay, let me bring in Musa Hussein. Musa Hussein, so we've heard Professor Bochi talk largely about the first part of that provision, about present and voting. But if the second part that comes right after that says, with at least half of all members of Parliament present. The majority leader and others in Parliament have said, if you look at that clause, that part of that, 104, and you're doing a numerical analysis, at least half will mean 137.5. And that 137 that the minority has cannot be half. What's your interpretation of this? Was there a breach? Kindly unmute for me, please.
Okay, thank you so very much, Ivan. Clearly, it appears to me that we have been thrown into some sort of constitutional crisis. If you call it so, in the sense that the provision 104 has never been tested this way. Has always been clear majorities on the minority side, or the majority side who can take decisions without the decisions being questioned when they are present in the House and voting. Present in the House and voting means you must be physically present in the chamber of Parliament. At least that's what the practice has been. You must be in Parliament. And so when a decision is going to be taken and the member raises the issue of quorum, a bell will have to be rung and the speaker will have to wait for 5 minutes to see whether members who are in their offices or who are attending to committee meetings can make themselves available for the decision to be taken. So present and voting has been interpreted in practice on the floor of the House to mean a member must be in the chamber for the purposes of taking that decision. And now when the decision is taken, and the member has reason to believe that the voice vote is so close that there cannot be a straightforward determination of whether the yes have carried it or the no's. A member who calls for a head count or division now subjects the whole decision-making process to a count. And so members of Parliament who are present in the chamber are counted for the purposes of determining whether the decision has met the constitutional threshold of the half members of Parliament being there, or whether the decision manifests what the majority of the people in that House who were present and voting have decided. And so, for me, Article 104 says that at least half the members of Parliament must be present and voting. At what point can we say that half of the members of Parliament were present in the House? Was it when the question was put? Was it when the decision was taken by a voice vote? Which voice vote then resulted in a challenge? Which challenge was disrupted by a walkout? So, I mean, if we are to determine this, then probably the majority will have to test what point do we say that majority or more than half members of Parliament were present in the House when the decision was taken. Because as we all watch on TV, there was a voice vote, which voice vote then culminated into a division or a head count. Now, the issue is many people are latching onto the 137.5. And some people, because we cannot have half a human being, some people have said that 137.5 should be rounded up to 138. Now, 138 times 2 is 276. And we know that a parliament constituted by 276 members cannot transact any business. Any business that they transact is void ab initio, because the parliament of Ghana is duly constituted by 275 members. So how to deal with the 0.5 is a matter that Parliament itself must determine. Parliament itself must determine that. Whereas a 276-member Parliament cannot be recognized by law in this country, running the 0.5 figure up to 138 clearly will give you a 276-member Parliament. Is that what the drafters of the Constitution anticipated? No. A 274-member Parliament is still within the capacity, the standing establishment of Parliament of 275, and can transact business. I believe that the Speaker's decision to put the vote and also to record the vote as having, reflected a rejection of the budget is proper, but that decision can be challenged, and we hope that tomorrow the proceedings in Parliament will show clearly how the challenge procedure will manifest.
And it just brought me to my next point, really, about, and both of you, Professor, Kofi Abuchi and yourself, have just laid out the complexity of this. So this is not straightforward. But at the heart of this, Dr. Draman, is the fact that we have a budget that has been rejected, without which we are moving from a constitutional crisis to a national crisis of, catastrophic proportions, because we need a budget for an economy that is already, struggling, within COVID. We need that budget approved, right? So I wonder, back to you, Dr. Draman, having just appreciated from the lawyers what the complexities are, what does it take? What would it take? You've been working with both sides on this matter. We haven't seen this before since it happened in the 1981-82 under Liman. This is first time we are seeing this in our time. So what would it take to get this resolved, do you think? Is there a provision within the standing orders? You study Parliament, and so you could probably help us here. Is there a provision within the standing order that allows this to be resolved?
Well, Evans, let me say good evening to my co-panelists here. And let me say, I don't think that there is any provision in the standing orders that would help us get out of this stalemate. I think what would help us get out of this stalemate, in my very humble opinion, is that I think the two sides need to be real. These legalities are fine because they help in trying to, get us evolve. Our democratic practice. As we grow into the Fourth Republic. But at this stage, as you rightly noted, we have a very big crisis that is looming. That is an economic crisis because, like you rightly noted, we have seen this happen in the US. And even there, we've seen the brunt of, a government shutdown on the ordinary person. When we have it here in our country, I think it's going to be catastrophic, particularly for those who live by the day. So what we have been saying right from day one, and day one here, January 7th, was that, look, we are in a completely new territory in terms of our parliamentary practice. We've never seen this before, and that both sides will need to, at all times, have some way of, continuously dialoguing and trying to find some middle ground on all issues that come before the House. Because like the professor said, in the past, we've seen, both sides with their numbers, and then whatever comes before Parliament, gets approved. We've never had this during the budget process. And for me, watching this our parliament and watching many other parliaments, in budget politics, we categorize parliaments into three. The first category is those that have, budget making powers. So we call them budget making parliaments. And the second category is those parliaments that are called budget influencing parliaments. And the third are the parliaments that have neither of the two powers. And over the years, when we observe our parliament and all the budgets that have come through in the Fourth Republic, we've always placed our parliament in the third category. And for me, I woke up now believing that, look, it looks like it was politics that has been shortchanging Ghanaians, and that over the years, I believe there have been all kinds of issues with all kinds of, but because they had the numbers, we never had a situation where anybody was speaking for us as the ordinary people and fighting for our cause, like as is the case of the e-levy and many other issues that have been raised. So for me, I think this is very interesting, and we are going to see a lot of this play out in the next 3 years, Evans. If the leaders of parliament don't find a way, first of all, to build bridges between the minority and the majority, knowing that, look, they both need each other. The minority would have to hold the government to account, hold the feet of the government to the fire. But at the same time, there's a limit to how much they can do that, because if it begins to hurt us, the ordinary people, then their action might become counterproductive and they might not be seen as a likable alternative looking through to 2024.
Yeah, Dr. Draman, let me ask you very quickly and very briefly. There's a school of thought that says that the majority side can file a motion of rescission to undo what was done on Friday, and then once that carries, they then table a fresh motion for the budget vote. Now they have their 138 in the House, in addition to the independent, can then approve. Is that a path to getting this done?
Well, I mean, that's a legal path, but at this point, I think we need to have some common sense play out here. I don't think that, the first deputy speaker is now going to preside tomorrow.
Yes.
That means that their side is reduced by 1. And from my understanding, it looks like even on Friday, there was 1 member
was
the majority
yes.
was missing. So assuming that member still is not in parliament, you go the legal way, then what you are trying to do now is to say we are shutting the door for negotiation and for compromise.
Okay.
And I think that's, for me, that would not be something that I would advise the leaders to do.
Let's talk a bit about the compromise. I want to bring in right now Professor Eric Osesibe about that compromise that needs to happen, because there are key economic issues, revenue generating issues that is at the heart of this debate. Prof, thanks for joining us. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Ghana. Let me ask you, so the minority had laid their conditions. 3 of the key ones that they are not willing to compromise on relates to the removal or the withdrawal of the 1.75 e-levy. Second is they don't want to hear about a JAPA deal brought back. But third, they want government to spend on the Cater Sea Defense project. These are the 3 key ones that they don't want to negotiate on. Can the budget, can this country, can the economy accommodate these 3? Can we do without these 3? Hello, Prof? Hello, Prof? Hello? Hello, Prof? Okay. Hello, Prof. Can you hear me, sir? Okay, we don't seem to have it. Let me quickly go to Inusa Fuseni. Mr. Fuseni, I want to bring back that question about, I'll come back to the economic issues very shortly, but let me quickly bring you in and I'll get Professor Abochi's thoughts on this as well. On the way forward, though, Professor Dr. Dramani talks about dialogue is a way out, find a consensus. But is there a way for the majority now, as we have had suggested, to also use the route of a rescission?
Hello.
Hi, Professor Sibe.
Hello.
Hello? Unfortunately, we're having a challenge with the line. Let's get it fixed so we can talk to him. But let me quickly bring in, whilst we do that, Mr. Inusa Fuseni. Mr. Fuseni, what do you think about that option to dealing with this, the vote of rescission, the motion for rescission? Mr. Fuseni, kindly unmute for me. Hello, Mr. Fuseni. I can't hear you because you've muted the conversation. Please unmute for me. Okay. Mr. Fuseni, I can't hear you because this thing is muted. Let me bring in Professor Abochi on this. Professor Abochi, so we have a situation where your view is that Parliament should resolve this and not go to court. Because obviously you've talked about the Supreme Court's necessarily don't want to touch what Parliament decides to do. But in the end, it comes back to how this is interpreted by Parliament itself. And if you read the standing orders, it appears that the Speaker is the final authority on this matter in the House. With your knowledge of how these things work in terms of making a final decision, and of course, this is all conversation based on a budget. How do you expect the Speaker to approach this tomorrow, knowing how these decisions are made, interpretations that may be put on this?
Well, invariably, realpolitik will dictate matters. In addition to that, law also plays a role. Now, realpolitik in the sense that the second deputy or the first deputy speaker is a standing speaker. And often standing positions have all the powers that are vested in the substantive office that they act. However, in practice, standing positions are normally very careful how they undo the things that have been done by the substantive. And so from a real politics standpoint, it stands to reason that if rational things are anything to go by, the first deputy speaker is likely to be cautious in terms of how decisions are taken that apparently and optically seem to reverse the things that the substantive speaker has done for the short period that he's away on medical treatment, as we've been informed publicly. So, that's the part that has to be considered in terms of the speaker's role. However, as has been noted by the co-panelists, it's imperative to also understand that the political dynamics of things invariably makes this parliament very cagey. And it does because once the deputy speaker steps in the shoes of the speaker, he loses the vote. And by reason of losing the vote, the side from which he comes, before he actually started playing the role of an acting speaker, that side invariably becomes deficient in terms of the numbers. So immediately, the very things that side may expect, certain cures or certain curative measures to be taken, they would have lost the power in terms of the voting rights. So it stands to reason that a lot needs to be negotiated in this parliament. In fact, the way a lot of things played out last week suggests that so many things could have been done from a back channel perspective. So many things could have been done from a background consultation perspective. It appears that sometimes the membership of parliament forgets the fact that this parliament is like no other. And they tend to use the tools of old and the dynamics of old, which in reality do not apply in the current parliament because of the formation and because of the number, distribution, and deployment. And so it seems to me that the only way this can actually be resolved is if the political back-channeling and the various, as it were, background consultation and the political negotiations, if these are gotten right, I think this matter can be resolved very quickly and very easily. But if any side tries to push too much the legalities, that side is likely to come against difficulties because whichever way you look at things, you find out that one party or one side normally doesn't have the powers, normally doesn't have the numbers to, as it were, push through the kinds of things he wants to do without consideration of the other side. So that's the difficulty that they have.
Very interesting there. So I guess it comes back to what Dr. Dramani said. At this moment, the best option out is to negotiate, is to talk. And in fact, just before we came on air, we've been speaking to our sources within both sides. They were supposed to meet as around 7 p.m. The minority side said they were waiting for the majority side to come and sit and talk. And that meeting hasn't happened yet. Of course, there's a lot of time between now and tomorrow morning when something could, they can reach some form of consensus on the matters. And so we wait to see what plans are before Parliament resumes at 10 a.m. Let me quickly bring in Professor Asibe, who's joining us now on phone. We lost him on Zoom. Prof, I asked you the question earlier. The minority have told us that there are 3 issues. They listed 5, but they've said there are 3 issues around which they will not budge. The e-levy must go, and we don't want a JAPA. But then there was a third one, which is that include a spending item in the budget for the Kita Sea Defense project. If you take the first 2, for example, can the economy do without that? And then there's a third one, which is spending. So you're taking away 2, avenues of making more money for the economy. And then the minority says, add 1 more that actually will spend more without the 2. Can the economy take this? Is there a fair compromise to reach? Oh, goodness, I think we've lost him. We're going to take a break. When I return, hopefully I can get his thoughts on this. And I will hear from Yunusa Husseini, who was muted earlier. Stay with me. My guest joining me, obviously, for this conversation is Yunusa Husseini, who is a former member of parliament. He's himself a former ranking on the Constitutional Legal Affairs Committee, Professor Bochi and Dr. Rashid Draman. I lost earlier Professor of Economics Osasibe. He's Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Ghana. Hopefully he's back on the line that can sustain the conversation. Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Ivan.
Yes. So my question about the three issues that the minority have laid out as their condition. Can this economy contain those?
Well, definitely it's going to be difficult because if you look at the budget is looking to raise certain amount of revenue, about 100 billion, and that is the amount of revenue that is going to be disbursed along compensation payments for government workers, for interest payments, for capital expenditure, and all of that. And so some of it, which I think that it is definitely going to be difficult for the budget or for the finance ministry to make compromises on, largely because it will throw the entire budget out of gear. And if you know how government finances, given the debt overhang that, and the interest payments, and then the statutory payments that really give the budget no flexibility, it is definitely going to be difficult for the finance minister to, compromise on some of the demands that have been put forward. Of course, some of it can be readjusted and then revised to meet them halfway, so to speak. But to take everything on board, I think that it definitely will not help the budget as it stands.
On the e-levy, do you expect, say, a possible reduction in a 1.75 and maybe also exempting a bit more services? What's realistic?
Yeah, I think there should be some middle ground. I think that we have to try to meet each other halfway somewhat. My thinking is that perhaps it could be reduced a little bit, maybe between 1 to 1.5, so that in a way government can still be able to raise enough revenue to finance the budget, because it also has a far-reaching implication for our economy. If government is unable to raise the revenue, already there's a heightened risk for investors. Investors are beginning to feel apprehensive about the economy, and so you can see some kind of impact on even on our currency at the moment. And so if there's going to be any indication that government will not be able to raise the revenue that is expected, then it definitely would going to hurt this economy the more. Growth is going to suffer eventually if we begin to have the withdrawals and capital flight and all of that, and which will affect all of that. So I think it's in the best interest of the country that the middle ground is reached so that we can have the budget passed as soon as possible to forestall any calamity, if I should.
Prof, thank you for the brief intervention there. Let me wrap up with thoughts from Mr. Fuseni. Mr. Fuseni, I was asking you earlier, you've been in Parliament for so long. The majority side have hinted that one of the things they will consider is this motion of rescission. I've heard both Professor Abuchi and Dr. Draman say that possibly may not be the way to go. What's your own take on that?
Well, Evans, that surely is one of the options available to the MPP, to the majority in Parliament. There's a subsistence decision of the Speaker, and that decision has to be vacated before any decision can be taken on the budget. Mm-hmm. And to vacate that decision, you either come by way of a motion to rescind the decision that was taken on Friday, mm-hmm. or you come by revocation if you believe that that decision was taken wrongly. And so they have to do that. But let me hasten to add that that is not mutually exclusive to consultation. What is happening presently throws up more the need for both parties to engage more, both on the floor of the House and outside the House. And even for the leadership of both parties, the NPP party in government and the NDC in opposition, to engage more on building consensus negotiation and factor into whatever policy decision of this country the views of the NDC or the views of the minority in parliament. You know, the election 2020 threw up the need for further and better consultations between the ruling class, that is government, and the minority. And the fact that we are not using the channels of consultation to be able to overcome these difficulties that we have in governance, that is what has brought us to this present position. I believe tomorrow, no matter what happens, whether it is going to be by a motion of rescission or a revocation, the majority side of parliament will have to engage with the minority because, like Professor Abuchi said, and supported by the standing orders and the constitution. If a member of the MPP or the majority side in parliament ascends the seat of parliament, the seat of the speaker, he loses his vote. And if that vote is lost, the numerical strength of the MPP and the majority in parliament will come down to 137. Being so, if all the members of the NDC are present in parliament and voting, you will have a tie. And when there is a tie without negotiations and consultations, the budget will fail. And so it is between the devil and the deep blue sea. It appears to me that they simply have no option. By this time, the General Secretary of the MPP should be talking to the General Secretary of the NDC. President Nana Akufo-Addo should be talking to former President Mahama. Chairman Saboso should be talking to Haruna Idrisu to see how they can resolve this difficulty. It's a real difficulty. And nobody should underrate the determination of the minority to ensure that they have their way.
Very interesting indeed. I mean, all will become very obvious. Dr. Draman, let me give you 30 seconds before I wrap up. Have you seen anything like this before? And you've worked with the two leaders. Do you think that they have the will to sit and talk and break a deal? Quick 30 seconds, Dr. Draman. Please unmute for me.
Yes, they do have the will, Evans. And then on Friday, we saw the finance minister in parliament trying to build consensus. I think this should have happened way before, many weeks before. And this is what we would like to see going forward. There is nothing wrong with trying to build consensus and trying to negotiate, particularly given the kind of dispensation in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, Doc, thank you very much. Professor Abuchi, I'm grateful. Mr. Fuseni also, and Professor Osasibi there. Tomorrow is a big day. We'll see how this plays out in the House. I know there are meetings late into the night to try and resolve this between the both sides. We'll be back here digesting all of it by close of day. Join me then.